Good afternoon, students. Good afternoon, faculty. Good afternoon, visitors. This is our third declamation competition of the year. And as usual, last week, each of your halls held its own in-hall competition to select two speakers to represent your hall at today's debate. And I was pleased to hear that a number of freshmen turned out. And in fact, they didn't only turn out, some of them won. And so two of them are competing today. This is a new thing for us. In the past, freshmen haven't been allowed to compete. And so you upperclassmen better watch out. They're coming after you. Today, students are debating the following thesis. The pen is mightier than the sword. The pen is mightier than the sword. Now, these, as you may have noticed, these declamation competitions are a bit different from the kinds of speaking competitions you may have seen before. They are not isolated one-off speeches, right? This is a debate, and students are required to engage with other speakers. Moreover, they are prohibited from collaborating with other speakers, which means they don't know what the other speakers today are going to say. And so this requires them to adapt their speeches in the moment, impromptu. And this is very difficult to do well if you've tried it, as most of you have. While you're preparing your speech, you can't just think about your three favorite arguments for your position. You have to canvass the thesis and discover every possible argument that might arise on your side or on the other side, and be prepared to respond to any of them in case the other person brings it up. And that's difficult to do. Now, if we allowed speakers to give these isolated speeches, these one-off speeches, or to speak with other speakers ahead of time so that they know what the others are going to say, I can assure you the speeches would be probably a little bit more polished than they would be otherwise, right? It's obviously easier to prepare a speech if you know exactly what's coming at you. But that's not how the real world works, right? When the faculty are having our faculty meeting and we're debating some kind of policy, we don't know what the others are going to say in the room. We need to be able to respond in the moment. If I want them to come to my side, I've got to be able to formulate a persuasive rebuttal in the moment. Same, in the Senate. Senators on the Senate floor, when they're debating some policy, they don't know what the others are going to say, and they need to be able to think on their feet and adapt in the moment. I want to leave you with a little quote here from Quintilian that might help you appreciate what our speakers are facing and up against today, and the importance of why we're doing what we're doing. This is what Quintilian says. The greatest fruit of our studies, the richest harvest of our long labors, as it were, is the power of improvisation. A man who does not succeed in this should, in my opinion, give up public work and use his one talent, which is for writing, for other purposes instead. It is hardly decent for an honest man to promise help publicly, which may fail in the very moment of danger, and as it were, point the way to a harbor which is only accessible to a ship with a gentle favoring wind. After all, countless sudden emergencies arise which force us to speak on the spot, either before the magistrates or if a trial is brought forward. If such a thing happens, is the orator to stand tongue-tied and say to those who are calling for the voice that will save them and are lost at once if no help comes, that he wants a postponement and peace and quiet until his words are crafted and firmly planted in his memory and his voice and lungs ready for action? What principle allows one to be an orator on select occasions only? The arguments we expected and against which we are prepared, and against which we prepared our written text often fail to appear, and the whole cause is suddenly changed. An advocate has to change his plan to meet the varying circumstances of causes, as a pilot has to change his course when a storm strikes. And what is the use of all that writing, assiduous reading, and long years of study if we still have the same difficulty that we had when we first started? If a man always has to make the same effort, he will have to admit that his past efforts were wasted. We don't want your past efforts to be wasted. So we create opportunities like this for you to cultivate this skill. So, without further ado, allow me to introduce our judges for this afternoon. We've got a panel of 5 faculty on our judging panel today. Dr. Christopher Schlecht, which I would invite down to the front row with the other judges. I'm glad you showed up. I was worried we wouldn't have you here. Dr. Jason Greaser, Dr. David Erb, Dr. Jordan Dorney, and not a doctor myself. Our speakers for this afternoon, Eva Harris, Paul Murrell, Juliana McDowell, Renata Swait, Jonathan Adams, Mason Plattner. Speakers have 8 minutes to speak. You will receive a 7-minute warning from Jackson here, and the first speaker has the option to split her time and to come back at the end to respond to her opponents. So, without further ado, please welcome to the stage Miss Eva Harris.
There once was a man who detected a threat to his nation. This man was not a writer or a military officer. In fact, he was an amateur painter from the country, but he could see the threat more clearly than anyone. In order to save the nation that he so dearly loved from its downfall, he began studying politics and history. He entered political life and was immediately adored by the people. He even wrote a memoir to bring his folkish philosophies into society. He captivated the hearts of the people with his speeches and writings. He could do no wrong in the nation's eyes. Men were eager to follow his lead. Women and children hung on his every word. That politician was Adolf Hitler. The pen is mightier than the sword. In order for this debate to be possible, we must assess the might of each weapon in the same way. It is apparent that we cannot argue that the pen is mightier in writing than the sword is in killing. Those criteria are not equal. We also cannot argue that the pen is mightier than the sword at writing, nor can we argue that the sword is mightier than the pen at killing. Each was not meant for the obvious utility of the other. Ergo, we must conclude a common objective for the use of each weapon. I would argue that this objective is socio-political change. The pen then represents change of culture and politics through the written word, whereas the sword is most suited to change the socio-political landscape via martial force. The power of the sword is fairly obvious. After all, the feeling of cold steel under your nose is not easily mistaken. The power of the sword is that it first and foremost inspires fear. If all goes well for the sword bearer, then the people will fear his blade enough to submit to him. If not, his regime will be cast off. The power of the pen also depends upon the reader's understanding and reaction to it. However, unlike the sword, the pen has the ability to be subtle and not so subtle. Let's go back to the example of Hitler. Here's a taste of his writing. Quote, "Is there any form of filth or profligacy, particularly in cultural life, without at least one Jew involved in it?" Hitler hated the Jews. He said he hated the Jews, and yet Germany loved him because of his rhetoric. Because of their love, he could do what they willed. The people's cooperation is imperative for socio-political change, so the means of convincing them to accept the change is of the utmost importance. The sword is effective for as long as people are fearful. However, the people will not tolerate tyranny forever. The hearts of the people must be won, and what better way to win them than with words? As you consider the arguments of the other speakers, remember the importance and power of this love. I reserve the rest of my time for the end.
The pen is mightier than the sword if the sword is very short and the pen is very sharp. Adolf Hitler is a wonderful example of this. Unfortunately, he came in a time following a massive war in which force, the sword, was employed dramatically. How was it employed? It was employed by removing the national identity of Germany, or Prussia. To give credit to Adolf Hitler, very good, 100% effective, and his rhetoric was effective. But first, he was in the military. He was a war hero, using the sword. And before then, he was dealing with a people that had been suppressed in their national militaristic identity. Now, with that opening, I'm going to pull back a little bit. What is might? Because we are asking which is mightier, the pen or the sword. So first we need to know, what is might? Well, might comes from, or is synonymous with power in English, which is the ability to accomplish. The pen is the academic, the written, the studied. The blade is the militaristic and the natural strength of man. Might does not require the pen to exist. The blade does not require the pen to be mighty. Thus, the blade is mightier. So which is mightier, according to this? The blade is not merely a matter of violence. It is not merely a matter of killing people or attacking people. It is also the threat of danger to oneself. As such, this does not require the pen. We will talk about the effects of the pen in inspiring people. That is what you will hear from almost every single person for the next hour. But people can be inspired through violence, and they were for centuries. For my sophomore friends especially, people were inspired by fear, by the sword, for centuries. We read this in Thucydides, and we read this in Herodotus. It was not love of Cambyses that made him powerful. It was his strength. For centuries before the coming of Christ, it was might makes right, not intelligence makes right. I will remind you of another dictator, another tyrant. His name, Julius Caesar, a brilliant rhetorician, but also a genius general and a fantastic warrior. His rhetorical abilities would have meant nothing if he didn't also accomplish many, many martial victories. Now, an inevitable argument that will be brought up, so for reference, this comes back to self-sufficiency. His rhetoric was dependent upon his might. Now, an argument that will be brought up time and again by my opponents will be that the Lord, that God, used the pen to convey his word in the Bible. This is true. He also used the blade to protect Israel for centuries, not just the pen. So we see two things here. We see that God uses both blade and pen. Now, all of us have been through, Dr. Harmon's or Dr. Longshore's theology, and we know that this means one or another thing. This means this is how he acts towards us in his economy with the pen or the blade, or this means that it is an attribute of God, the pen. Well, he also uses the blade. And by nature of this prompt, we are considering one versus the other. Thus, they both are attributes of God, or they are both simply tools he uses in his creation. If they are attributes of God, then what applies to them? We all know it's divine simplicity, which means you cannot say one is greater or lesser in the ultimate sense. So I want us to steer clear of discussing what is the ultimate sense of the two, and instead we need to focus on what is the proximate, what is the real effect that it has in our lives, and how do we have to look at it in a practical sense? Because that is ultimately the application that the sword or the pen can have. Now, to understand this point, I have made the claim that the pen is merely the academic, the written, the studied. Where does the quote come from? The pen is mightier than the sword. It comes from Edward Lytton Burton. Who was he? He was an Enlightenment playwright. And one of his core tenets is that you can educate the evil out of people. Well, we all know that's not true. Look at our society right now. What do you see? You see educated people believing in LGBTQ plus QYZ, right? Everywhere. And yet, these are the academics. These are the people wielding the pen. Now you say, this is an aside. We're not discussing, are there intelligent people that are against us? No, we're discussing, is the sword mightier? Well, I guarantee you, if any dedicated group got together and started enforcing our obscenity laws, this would disappear. The pen could not stop it. I'll make an even simpler and closer to home example. In our own school, we have a dress code. At times, I might get canceled for this, I've been warned. At times, there are a substantial amount of people that ignore this dress code. Yet the pen says we have to do it. So why is it being ignored? Well, I guarantee you, if Dr. Newman walked into school with a saber at his hip, and he just lightly wrapped the back of your leg, you would abide by the dress code. That is the pen being mightier than the sword, by the way. So this is another point. Then what is the role of the sword? The sword can enforce the pen. But the pen cannot enforce the sword. The pen can only dictate the actions of the sword if the natural, if the mighty, determines that they will abide by it, such as David or David's mighty men. Remember, the pen is only mightier than the sword if the sword is very short and the pen is very sharp. If the sword gives authority to the pen. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was very kind. Well, I would like to tell you a tale. We can call it a tale of two countries, if you will. Two countries that both shared one major problem. They were corrupted by slavery. So tell me, what could these two nations do? How could they rid themselves of this vile cancer that was eating them from the inside out? Well, in one country, the solution was to fight. For 4 long, bloody years, brother slaughtered brother. Hundreds and thousands of lives were ended to save the lives of others. But in the other country, all it took was one man with a weapon so powerful, he was able to end slavery without shedding a single drop of blood. I think you all know the two countries I am speaking of. I'm referring to, of course, of America and of Britain, of the Civil War, which tore our country in two, the repercussions of we can still feel to this day, and of William Wilberforce, who, by the power of his pen, was able to persuade his countrymen to abhor what they once approved of. So when it comes to our discussion for today, whether the pen is mightier than the sword, whether words are more powerful than military might, I would have to say yes, indeed, the pen is mightier for 3 reasons. The pen has the power to penetrate the soul. The pen has the power not only to break, but to build. And ultimately, I believe that it is actually the pen that inspires the sword, not the sword that inspires the pen. So, the pen has the power to penetrate the soul. Think about the books that you read when you were younger, how they have shaped the way you think and shaped the way you act. Those words have molded you into who you are today. They have affected lasting change in your life. But the sword
cannot inspire this lasting change. Paul mentioned how the sword inspires fear. And I guarantee you, if someone held a gun to your head, you would do whatever they told you to do, perhaps even against the beliefs you may write with the pen. But as soon as that gun is gone, as soon as that soldier is somewhere else, its power is gone. It cannot create a lasting change in your life. This is not like the pen. The pen can actually plant seeds of change in your soul that it can be rooted deep, that can grow, that can bloom. A potent example of this is a story of a young man who once hated God and was fleeing from him. But one day, he walked into a bookstore and picked up a novel written by George MacDonald. He says that that very night, his imagination was baptized when he read that book. That young man was C.S. Lewis, and the words that George MacDonald wrote inspired C.S. Lewis to write his own words that have affected each and every one of you to this very day. But the pen also has the power not only to build, but to break. The sword can only break. It can kill. That is a mighty power. It can snuff out a human life. But that is all it can do. Some may say that the sword can build an empire, but I would say that there are two ways to have the tallest building in town. One is to build the tallest building yourself, and the other is to knock down all the other buildings that are taller than yours. And I think when it comes down to it, the sword falls into the second category. It has a tendency to crush other cultures that get too big for their britches, as we might say. But the sword, the pen, also shares this brutal power to break, as can be seen from cruel words on social media that drive some people to suicide, or perhaps the words of a serpent in a garden that persuaded all of humanity to fall into sin. You see, the pen can persuade our soul. It can deceive us into falling into darkness. You see, the sword can kill the body, but the pen can kill both the body and the soul. But the pen can also build. That encouraging text message sent by a friend that just brightens up your day. That inspiring poem that creates change in your life. The words of a pastor that can redirect the course of your entire life. Yes, sometimes these things can be ignored, but as we have seen throughout history, often they are not. Often they have a great effect upon us. So occasionally, yes, the pen can be ignored, but not forever, not for long. And that is why I ultimately believe that it is the pen that inspires the sword. Now, many people have mentioned those great military conquests, those battles that have changed the entire face of our society, that have redirected the course of history. And many people have mentioned great military leaders, such as Julius Caesar, or perhaps despicable men, such as Adolf Hitler. But the thing that most great military leaders have in common is that they are indeed great orators. Why are speeches given to bands of disheartened soldiers? Why do revolutionaries always write pamphlets to support their cause? Is it not to remind people of old ideas or to persuade them of new ones? You see, the pen is what shapes the minds and the hearts of the people. The pen gives people something worth fighting for. The pen dictates how, why, when, or if the sword will ever be used. No one would wield weapons unless the pen had first inspired them to. So whenever Paul or Renata or Mason bring up some great military conquest, whenever they bring up some great military battle, remember, it wouldn't have happened if the pen hadn't been at play. It is the pen that first must be lifted before the sword can be lifted, shaping the hearts and minds of the people, giving them a reason to fight for. But I actually don't think that I have to convince you anymore of the power of words, and that is because I believe that you are already convinced. And that may seem like a strange thing to say, but I say this because you are here. You are here to build culture. You are here to be a leader. And how are you doing this? You are doing this by immersing yourself in the great writers who have gone before you. You are doing this by learning to write well. If you truly believed that the sword was more efficient, more powerful, why didn't you go to a military school? Why didn't you go to West Point? I think it's because you intrinsically know that there is great power in the pen, power that the sword can never wield. I hope that my pen has convinced you of the power of words tonight, but if it has not, perhaps our next declamation will be a duel. Thank you.
That's going to be a bit of a tough act to follow. I want to begin by saying that I am the daughter of a poet. My dad has published 2 collections of poetry, spent years teaching language and literature, and his entire life reading and writing. And when we were kids, he taught my siblings and I to love words whenever we use them to write, to read, or to speak. I know very well how powerful the written word can be. And yet here I stand, about to argue that the sword is mightier than the pen. And I believe very firmly that I have good reason to. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it clear, like Paul, that you can't use the Jesus juke here. Juliana didn't do this, but I could still foresee the temptation coming up. Nobody is ever going to be able to argue that the Word of God is not mightier than anything man makes or does. If the Lord had decided to give us, with the Scriptures, a magical, glowy, supreme sword of spiritualness, with all the strength of his hand within, then that would be the most incomprehensibly powerful sword to ever exist. The Bible is the written word of God himself. Of course, it's more powerful than anything else in this world. We're not arguing about the Word of God. We're debating on the human scale. Is the pen of man mightier than the sword? I say it's not, and I've got 2 arguments to back that up with, related to the nature of the 2 powers that the pen and the sword wield. First off, the pen. The pen is mighty. I already said that I do not want to deny that. The recorded words of men have exhorted entire cultures and peoples to action, greatness, and glory. People's writing can exhort other men to action. The entire point of writing is to move people to do something, and it's the action of the people reading that brings the writing to complete fruition. Writing without a reader is useless. You need other people to take what the author communicates and actually do something with it for the writing to have any kind of impact. You need multiple people if you really want to do something big and culture-changing, like our opponents like to talk about. The pen can reach millions and millions. The pen can abolish slavery without spilling a single drop of blood. That is only potential power. For the pen to have any effect whatsoever, it depends on the reader's decision. And if the reader does decide to do something with what they read, the kind of action and its degree of potency will then depend on how capable the reader actually is. Moving to my second point, the sword does not have that maybe it will, maybe it won't kind of power. The sword doesn't rely on anyone but the one wielding it for its power, and you cannot take that lightly. Swords and other weapons of war are made to deal damage, and more specifically, they're made to deal death. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, went down into the grave for 3 days and 3 nights to defeat death. It is not one of the minor enemies we encounter in this world. Death is the final outworking of the curse on God's design, and one we use the sword to inflict on other people. The sword has the ability to literally cleave the human composition in twain. When we use the sword or some other equivalent weapon of war, we are splitting the image of God in 2 and taking all the good work and potential joy in the Lord that comes with life from a human being, never to be reclaimed again until kingdom come. Every chance for the pen to bring someone to salvation, as Juliana so powerfully convinced us it can, is gone. The power of a sword is to send a man to death, and to compare it to the pen again, the only person this enormous power needs to be effective is the one wielding it. You don't even need that much skill, though it does help, to use a gun and do irreparable damage to someone, to take someone from this world. Now, an objection you might hear from the opposing side, in fact, you did hear, you heard it very clearly from Juliana, is that the pen has the power to change culture and the sword does not. Conquest is the major way that cultures have gone through dramatic change throughout history. Conquest is empires razing cities and transplanting peoples and reconstituting governments, and all of that deeply changes the culture of the people to whom it happens. Not to mention the culture of the people actually absorbing the other nations into their domain. And I would like to remind you, because Juliana did begin to deal with this point, we're not talking about the right exercise of might here. We're just talking about the exercise of might, whether it's done justly or no. Now, to finish up, I want to try and use a thought experiment to drive my point home. I'm sitting here giving you a speech that I wrote to try and convince you of something. Most speeches are not meant to try and convince you to turn to weapons, but let's say that I was actually trying to convince you to use the sword's power. Let's pretend that I am some very evil human, trying to convince all of you to commit mass murder in a crowded place. In order for that to work, first of all, I need to be an amazing speaker. Everything Mr. Pinkhall dreams of in a rhetoric student. With unshakable conviction and, more importantly, an unshakable personality. In order for me to even have a shot of convincing you rhetorically, I have to have all that to even begin. Then, after I deliver my rousing speech, the majority of you needs to individually decide that I am actually worth listening to. You need to decide, and you need to decide, and you need to decide until at least the majority have actually decided, okay, let's go kill some people. And then, I would need you all to actually be capable of pulling that off. Especially if you want to do like those big culture-changing things that the other side so love to talk about, you need some very capable people in your arsenal to actually pull that off. Those are three very big ifs. And if I fail in the first, then the second isn't even part of the equation, and so on down the line. And I haven't even considered all the variables. I have seriously oversimplified what actually goes in to those speeches making things happen. Now, imagine if I were suddenly to pull out a gun as I stood up here. Suddenly you all suck in a breath, because I am holding something powerful. I am holding something that could end someone's life. The pen is one of the greatest blessings that we have, and it communicates beautifully many important things when used well. But beautiful communication only carries potential power. It depends on who and how many people read it for it to lead to any effect. Now think of someone holding a gun. They are holding a weight. They are holding something with the power to inflict death itself, simply by nature of what it is. The sword is mightier than the pen. Thank you.
Jericho!
Thank you all very much. Christianity is a religion of the sword. By it, in its strength, we go forth and conquer. We take captives and we tear down enemy strongholds. But the sword we wield is no ordinary one. And my opponents are going to call this a Jesus juke. They already have. But it is stronger than any other, dividing soul and spirit. It is mightier than any sword because it is the written word of God. all the way back to the garden. Words. Words have been the true method of warfare, not swords. The devil did not attack Eve with his fangs, but with his tongue. He conquered mankind by his words, and it is by words that God has chosen to save it. In neither case would the sword have been sufficient. Now, my opponents want to say that this is about the power of coercion. Every time their arguments come back to, if I'm pointing a gun at your head versus if I'm talking to you, I'm going to convince you with the gun. And that's ridiculous because that's simply not what this prompt is about. Do you really think the person who wrote that would have believed any differently? Of course not. We all know this point is not literal. It's about which has the true power to shape history. Whether the ability to captivate, to control the body, or to persuade the mind really can change the course of history. And my friends, the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. My argument is twofold. The second point is that in the hands of God's people it is mightier. But Paul, this one's for you. The first point is that it is also mightier in the hands of his enemies. The sword is mightier in the hands of evildoers because it captivates not only the body, but penetrates the mind. My opponent's strongest argument is in the great empires of history. I'd like to ask Paul just how much Cambyses has affected his life, but they tell us this is due to the sword, due to fear. But every empire has been forged by a convinced people. The pen pierces mankind where he's most vulnerable, his mind. Man is prone to believe what is destructive to both himself and to the world. He is easily manipulated by serpentine tongues. Now, Juliana mentioned having the tallest building in town, which is funny because it goes into something I'm about to say. The Tower of Babel. Babel would have been the greatest empire the world had ever known. The Lord said that because they were unified under one language, one speech, one direction of one word, then there was nothing that would be withheld from them which they proposed to do. The pen has that power to build up. It has great power to control both for good and for evil. But the moment they lost that direction by the word, their empire dissolved. They could do nothing. Evil men persuade the masses by writing, by speaking, by media, and even by entertainment. One man with a sword is a joke, but one man with a pen can turn the world upside down. My friends, how was Western civilization conquered? Was it by wicked swords? Or was it by wicked pens? Hume, Rousseau, Darwin, Nietzsche, Marx, their ideologies forged the modern regimes, not the sword. The greatest empires in history were not the ones that Cambyses started, but the ones that Karl Marx, that Lenin, that Stalin started. These men who personally had no power to coerce others, but convinced them by their words. The sword is dependent on the might of words to direct it. Paul wants you to think it's mighty alone, but it's not. One sword can do nothing. Every soldier trained, every city sacked, every home burned, every opposition suppressed has been at someone's command. Tyrants have always relied on the pen to maintain control. Napoleon Bonaparte once said that 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. And I think we see how this rings true. An adoring press is essential to maintain power. From communist propaganda to the modern mainstream media warfare against so-called disinformation, dissent is the greatest threat to the state. You cannot fully conquer a people. You cannot conquer their hearts by sword alone, but you can by word alone. Secondly, words are more powerful in the hands of God's people. How did Christ choose to advance his kingdom? Not by the sword, but by the word. He directed his apostles to preach the gospel unto every creature, and that was his means by which all ends of earth would remember and turn to the Lord. The word is the weapon of our warfare, not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, for casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, for taking into captivity every thought, not just every body, but every thought, to the obedience of Christ. And it did. Christianity conquered the Roman Empire without waging a single war. Which is mightier? Christians have conquered nation after nation without needing to resort to the sword. Are we really asking this question? How can we maintain that the sword is mightier than the pen? Now, Paul and Renata have both argued that the pen is not by nature mightier than the sword. It's simply that God chooses to use it. But my friends, that is exactly what makes it mightier than the sword. Of course, God could have chosen any means. He could have given us a divine aircraft carrier dropped from heaven, fully stockpiled with the best Lockheed Martin can cook up. But he didn't. He gave us the written word, the sword of the Spirit. As mankind fell by the word, it was only fitting that the word should redeem mankind. My opponents don't want to allow this argument because they know that if it is, they can't win. They know that they're helpless against it. Now, Renata pointed out how Christ was killed by the sword. But may I remind you that the word rose again on the third day. The sword will not be resurrected. It will be beaten into a plowshare. The devil conquered mankind at the beginning by his words, and it's been a battle of words ever since. God has chosen to make words the more effective weapon than the sword, and thus it is more effective for both God's people and his enemies. To quote Lewis, it is a stronger angel, and therefore when it falls, a fiercer devil. Thank you.
Thank you, all previous speakers, as well as the audience, for listening. The pen and the sword are two foundational guards of any society. As Jonathan so aptly pointed out, the loss of the pen and the written law leaves a horde of barbaric lawbreakers, raping and pillaging according to their own desires and lusts. It leaves the mind of fallen man to bathe unrestrained in his own sinful degeneracy. It leaves each man's personal whim of justice to govern his own sword, completely disconnected from the unity which a written law provides and on which a society stands. And yet a well-penned legal tradition which does not command punishment by the sword renders itself unable to protect the unity, no matter how eloquently stated, that it describes. And we see this from the beginning. There was a flaming sword in the garden. Why? Was not the word of God, "You shall not eat of the tree," enough? And so I'll clarify. The negative is not arguing that there is no place for the pen. As Juliana so dismissed the sword, the pen is important for society, and that is why this prompt is not exclusive, but rather a conjectural issue concerning the quality of or greatness of might. Which is mightier? Not more important, not more necessary, perhaps even not more capable to effect change, but mightier. And so I'd like to draw you into the land of the theoretical. It's a bright night, and you're laying in bed, however NSA students do, attempting to go to sleep. The stars are shining and casting eerie light on the grains of the oak floor beneath your window. The night is quiet, even hushed, and the only noises daring to sound are the ones you can't figure out. That crunch, that creak, and of course the clock, and the irrational thought straining in the silence of your mind, there's someone in your house. No, that's of course what all the robbers think, is that the law forbids them from entering your house. No, of course not. The law does not forbid robbers from entering your house. That is the definition of a robber. So, what is the reason that you sleep at night? The handgun in your bedside table, the shotgun in your gun safe, or perhaps, for all you of the long-haired and fair sex, that frying pan. Or perhaps Or perhaps if you're Juliana, you grab your pen. No, absolutely not. Perhaps you've had such a feeling, and it is not the law that assuages your fears. There is something deep in your nature, an innate understanding that at the last extremity the pen cannot save. There must be a greater force, a power greater than the pen, something more coercive than the law. And so, let us look at the sword. The sword throughout the annals of history has been the driving cause of cultural change. The sword makes the straight way for the way for the pen to then perfect. It is in a sense like the human race, the marriage of man and woman. There's a singularity, a purpose, an equality of purpose, but there is a clear distinction. Man is the strength, the might. He clears the ground by the sweat of his brow, bends it to his will, drives it back into his proper place, and then brings the rough but tamed wilderness to lay in her hands. And she cares for it, beautifies it, shapes it. It is the woman who coaxes and crowns, and such is the pen. It cannot forge a society out of a barbarous people. It cannot break the will of a country. It cannot qualm the waves of an invading army. It cannot produce the fear that the sword commands, but it can coax, it can build, it can order, beautify, if and only if it is protected by the power of the sword. Now, I'd like to address some of the arguments that the affirmative have given. And I think perhaps a better way to state the point that Juliana was making, and perhaps Jonathan as well, is that the pen unifies and directs the sword, and thus the pen gives the sword efficacy. So despite the pen being its own work, being able to do its own work, it also empowers the sword. Now, an old decrepit man who can barely lift, much less wield a sword, can still command an army. But the might of the army is not in the words of the man. The might in the army is in the swords that he inspires. Certainly he directs and guides, but the might is not his words. The might is inspired by his words, but the might is in the sword itself. And the affirmative argument simply shows that the sword can be strengthened if it submits to the power of the pen to strengthen it. Now, I think, imagine with me for a moment the greatest evils that you can. Murder, rape, the greatest evils on the face of this planet. And God has given us a way to deal with these, and that is not the power of the word, it is the death penalty. The death penalty, the sword, exercised by the state more than any other thing, causes man to deal with his maker immediately. Now, Eva mentioned a dictator, Hitler, and perhaps we would laud Hitler's pen as the cause of World War II. But Jonathan mentioned that one sword can do nothing, but I would say to you that one bullet did kill Adolf Hitler. And as well, it was the invading British armies that brought down the force that he inspired. Now, perhaps some of you would speciously point out that I am standing on this stage to argue with my words the use of the sword. And this is possibly a good argument, but I could also bring up a sword, and if I look nasty enough standing on this stage, none of my opponents would come up here and face me. And if they did, I could kill them before they got to the microphone. Now, the following argument I think is one of the affirmative's clearest. Behold the long-enduring works of the pen, the classics of literature that have preserved and shaped societies for centuries. This has been brought up, the philosophies of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the poetry of Dante, Milton, and Spencer, the theology, Aquinas, Augustine, and Calvin, the music of Beethoven, Handel, and Bach, the language, the comedy, the history, the literature, perhaps ultimately the very word of God, as Jonathan pointed out. But each society is freed by the sword, and only then can the pen do its work. Would the literary foundations of Rome have been established without the sword? No, we cannot think of a more foolish question. And so yes, the pen of God, as Jonathan pointed out, the Spirit-inspired word is more powerful than the sword of man. But at the pinnacle of history, at the end of all things, we will see the faithful and the true, the King of Kings and the Lord of all earthly lords. on a white horse with blood on his robe, with a sword from his mouth and fire in his eyes, and he will tread out the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty.
Perfect. Recall when I spoke at the beginning of this debate, I emphasized that love conquers people far better than any threat. So how does a leader, whether monarch or tyrant, win the hearts of the people? One must remember that love cannot be forced. The will cannot be coerced by anything outside of itself. We know this thanks to Augustine's free will dialogue. However, love can be fostered through education. Dr. Smith changed our music taste by educating us about music history. Dr. Dorney taught us to love history by making us read good historians. Let's look at a Roman example. When the Romans conquered a people, they took some of the young men back to Rome to be educated in political and military life. This education fostered patriotism and brought conquered nations into society. This is how Rome was able to become one of the largest and longest standing empires in history. Rome grew its empire by the sword, but this was only sustained by the pen. Some might contest the example of power through esoteric writing that I gave earlier. After all, Hitler was only able to eliminate the Jews by killing them. However, if Hitler had only used the sword, his regime would not have lasted as long as it did. And even though Hitler was killed by the sword, his words endured. You can get Mein Kampf at the NSA library once I'm done with it. Hitler has captured... had captured the hearts of the people, just like the Romans did. Not only did he convince over 18 million men to join his military, he also captivated the hearts of over 2 million German children. He had the Hitler Youth hanging on his every word. Paul argued that we needed to look at the effect of the pen and sword in our lives. Sure, we're students of the classics, not swordsmanship. Paul has neglected to address the fact that there is a philosophy behind every sword. The sword is powerful, but it requires the philosophy behind it to direct it. To address Renata's argument, she said that the power of the sword depends on the people's reaction to it. So does the sword. I established that before. So I don't find this argument particularly compelling. I would like to address Mason's argument. Mason agreed that the goal of each weapon is socio-political change. He argued that the sword is mightier because it defends what the pen has already established. This makes the sword not a defender, or only a defender, not a changer. So it doesn't meet the criteria of this debate. The metaphor of gender politics that Mason used should also be under suspicion. We are at a co-ed school in a Christian community that does not take effeminacy lightly. And yet boys and girls are encouraged to come to NSA to learn to read, write, and see. NSA turns boys into men and girls into women through the same required books and curricula. Therefore, the weapons themselves are not masculine or feminine. Rather, it is a way in which and by whom they are used that brings about this quality. For a biblical example, Moses wrote the Pentateuch and Jael killed Sisera with a tent peg. Moses wrote down the law to lead the people, and Jael used her feminine hospitality to kill the Canaanite commander. Finally, I would like to exhort you to think about the implications of this debate. We are at NSA, where our mission is to graduate leaders who shape culture under the lordship of Jesus Christ. The goal of our school is to be the catalyst for cultural reform. And we do this through the rigorous study of the classics. If the sword is mightier, the fencing club would be mandatory. If the sword is mightier, you boys better bust it to boot camp. If the sword is mightier, I would encourage all the conservatory students to melt down their instruments to forge something more worthwhile. If the sword is mightier, we have toiled under this esteemed faculty in vain. If the sword is mightier, this esteemed faculty is not esteemed at all. They will be Plato's who have fallen to the level of Gorgiases, and NSA graduates are fools armed with an expensive bag of tricks. Do not turn NSA into a military academy. It already is one. Thank you.
Wow. I don't know if I should feel insulted or not. It was suggested today that perhaps we should, if we can't determine a winner, move on to a duel, and we'll have to discuss that at our next faculty meeting. All right, well, thank you, speakers. That was very enjoyable. All right, well, the judges have spoken. We have a clear winner and a clear second place and a clear third place. Just to remind you, in addition to hall points, the top three speakers each win points for their halls, but the top speaker also wins $150 cash. So without further ado, in third place from Ashdown Hall, congratulations, Mr. Mason Plattner. In second place, from Jericho Hall, and a freshman, Mr. Jonathan Adams. And the winner of the $150. Yeah, oh yes, we need the drum roll, yes. From Malta Hall, Juliana McDowell.